This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with musician, artist, journalist, and ex-blogger Nick Currie, better known as Momus. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Nick Currie, also known as Momus, is a singer, performer, songwriter, journalist, artist, unreliable tour guide, and now author of books with last year's publication of both the Book of Jokes and the Book of Scotland's. As of today, he is a former blogger. He's just finished his blog, Click Opera, on the eve of his 50th birthday. Nick, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I was thinking about reading your final post when I was reading Brian Eno's diary that he published, which I know you've also read yourself, at the end of which, just a year of entries, daily sort of regular personal diary entries, he says, "Oh, it's so good just not to have to write this damn thing tomorrow." Is there a similar feeling with the much larger effort you have just put the cap on?
Not really. No, it's not a relief at all, because blogging is the best thing I've done in years, and I feel like it's the ending, and maybe the happy ending, or maybe the sad ending of a very enjoyable thing, and it's become an ingrained habit in me. So actually, as soon as I decided to knew I was putting the blog to bed and ending it, in came a great story. Something, a conversation I was having with Ezra from Vampire Weekend, and I thought, wow, this is a great update to that Vampire Weekend story that we featured last year. And then I thought, well, I can't do it because the blog ends tomorrow. So it's frustrating. And your introduction calling me a former blogger, I mean, in a way, one reason I'm ending the blog is so that I don't get called Nick Currie blogger anymore. But actually, it's kind of even sadder to be the former blogger Nick Currie. So I'm hoping that'll be a very brief interim period, and then I'll be known as Nick Currie something else.
Now, I said all of those things and I could include more things that you've done in that introduction, but I do think when I read that, considering the region of the world you have your origins in, that's not the sort of thing appreciated by the UK, is it, when you do a lot of different things?
Well, I think there is a tradition of dilettantism. I mean, it's an Italian word, but I think in Scotland we probably have a less polite word for it, like you're just thrawn. You're a thrawn, or you're a tosspot or something. I don't know. Scottish people are also able to be leisurely and expansive in their interests, and we had a period of Scottish humanism, and the 18th century was full of amateurs and dilettantes in Edinburgh, actually. But I don't know. Yes, you can be a jack of all trades and a master of none, or you can be an amateur with its roots in the verb to love. So I think enthusiasm is tremendously important, and the blog was a way for me to find things to be enthusiastic about out there on the web every day, and sometimes. Mostly I was successful without getting jaded or jaundiced, but I did find myself moving in ever tighter circles. Like I would have this very small number of websites I'd click through every day, and I would say, but like, is it Brenda Lee? Is that all there is out there? It's huge. It's getting huger every day, the web, and yet, somehow it's not delivering. And why should it? Because it's not life, it doesn't have it can't give you the adrenaline rush of real life. But then again, real life seems very slow and grey after the web. So I don't know, there are only certain places on the planet which to me have the excitement and the speed of the internet, and one of them would be Tokyo, Japan.
But then it does seem to me that whereas there's a lot of exploration of the web that went on in Click Opera, it was also, at least to my mind as a reader, to an equal extent about your own life and the things you did in the concrete world. And I imagine the same mechanism went on, where it would be a driver to help you find interesting things, or to motivate you to find interesting things on the web. Was it also an engine of making life as interesting as you could make it?
It was, but I was a little bit worried because I was approaching a 1-to-1 ratio. In other words, the things you would talk about and the things you would do would approach, equality. That every single thing I would do in my real life would end up getting written about. And there is this saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. I forget who said that, but actually, it is worth living.
I want to go back a little bit to You mentioned earlier people would say Nick Currie blogger, and there was some sadness to seeing that title appended to your name. Now, is there something uniquely sad about the word blogger that no other word that could be put after your name has?
I don't think it's the associations of blogging. I don't mind that at all. I mean, it's essentially you're writing a journal, so you're a journalist. But it's just the sound of the word blog because it sounds like frog.
But at the same time, it does seem to be the case that you talk about, as you got toward the end of the blog, you talk about how you do want to transition to older older forms, more established ones that I believe you may have said less amateurish, though your blog itself did not have the feeling of amateurism. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is a kind of interesting question because I'm very struck by how pre-internet forms and post-internet forms might resemble each other. Or, I mean, the same kind of thing applies to copyright. For instance, pre-copyright, pre the bourgeois legal system, which guarantees the ownership of intellectual property, you had this anon-trad tradition. And then the internet and digital culture kind of reproduced that anon-trad culture, and anybody could have a go, say what they wanted, make their voice heard, and it was a sort of public marketplace of ideas, if you like.
Yes.
And so I feel I'm coming a different full circle. I'm coming back full circle to professional publications, to ink and paper, to the academic world, which of course I went through because I was a student and I went to university, and I come from a family of teachers. Everybody in my family except me really is a librarian or an academic of some kind. So maybe this is a different full circle. Like, I was kidding myself that I was part of this populist swell, this upsurge of populist energy that the internet represented. But the early internet actually was a fairly academic and elitist place, you know. I mean, when there were very few people on the internet, and when I started my website, for instance, in 95, and we were using sort of the Mosaic browser, and you would have maybe 2 people who would send you emails in the whole world, they would usually be academics. They would be on, you know, the whatever it was, the ARPANET, or, you know, these academic networks on the internet. And the internet got more popular and more. I mean, we're using Skype right now. I remember just like last year, it seemed you would regularly see 9 million people at the bottom of your Skype program. Now it's like 20 million people regularly using Skype. So these numbers keep expanding. And as they expand, the demographics of the internet start to look more and more like the demographics of the real world that we know out there when we walk down the street or when we travel. So, and the internet allows you to do this. It allows you to filter and to go back into your own ivory tower, your own peer group, your own little group of me and my friends. So I think that's kind of what's happening now. It's, in one sense, the internet's getting more demotic and populist and like the real world. In another sense, it's you don't have the same kind of interactions that you would have with unlikely strangers, I think, on the internet, unless you're using one of these horrible new random video chat programs.
Now you've written a bit about those, haven't you? You had one post recently where you signed on to it and had not the most palatable experience with that.
No, I wish I'd done that post, but I think that was a post by Rodri Marsden or somebody else. No, you must be mixing me up. Yeah, no, that wasn't my post. I've never used those. Somebody said, "What do you think of this?"
It was
new
Jason Kotke. Jason Kotke.
Oh, okay.
Now, as I was going to say before that. How far does I mean, you mentioned you started a website in 1995. How far does your engagement with computer networks go? I mean, were you on the precursors of the web, or was 95 essentially the beginning date for your presence on the internet?
I was on CompuServe from, I think, 93. I had an Atari computer. I mean, my first computer ever I bought in, I think, 87, and it was a word processor, basically could just do text. And then I had Atari computers to do music sequencing. And then I found you could put a sort of fake ROM in the side of a little slot at the side of those and turn them into cheaper Macs, but they could hardly do anything. But from that point, you know, early 90s, I was on CompuServe. Somebody actually friended me on Facebook recently, an academic in Scotland, and said, "We used to exchange emails in the early 90s. You probably don't remember." I certainly don't remember because I didn't even have email in the early 90s. I mean, as far as I recall, it all started in 93 for me. And there was no looking back. And that was around about the time I uttered my famous phrase about, "In the future, everybody will be famous for 15 people." I think that was really based on just messing around with, first of all, my word processor and seeing how how you could edit things with digital tools. But then the early days of, I guess, CompuServe and, communities, chat rooms, whatever. I've never been really big on just sort of trying to meet people through the internet. But I am interested in it as a kind of, I guess, a kind of sounding board and a kind of seminar where you could have a virtual seminar room and interested people from all over the world could come in and you could just sort of have a talking shop, a bit like these old Greek men who sit around outside cafes drinking black coffee and talking about politics.
And I must say, for someone who was well known before they began blogging, you did seem to have been quite enthusiastic about the possibilities of engaging directly with your readers. Was that something you were always excited about, or did you become that by blogging?
I think I was a little frustrated to be working in the music industry through record labels, journalists, and to always be mediated. And I didn't feel I was mediated very well by those people. I felt I could probably do their jobs as well as they could. And, there was a certain sense of, let me do that. Let me do my album sleeve. Let me do even my press, my PR. Let me write the press release, and I won't put any typos in it like you do, this kind of thing. So the internet was the ideal chance. I mean, I always had immaculate exercise books at school, my geography textbook. I still to this day know very little about geography, but I could lay it out beautifully. So I think the website and then later the blogging experience was about putting all those skills into one place and actually using it, as quite a shy person who doesn't really connect very well with people. I found it was a substitute and an alternative way to actually reach people. But I also found that I annoyed a hell of a lot of people, and this was actually very shocking to me. That I was getting described as a troll or arrogant or whatever it was. I found that kind of upsetting, but then I tried to develop a thicker skin, and because the internet it's like a peanut gallery, of course. It's like a stocks in a medieval village, and people are going to be pelting you with vegetables. You just have to come up with zings and be able to respond quickly and try not to be as nasty as they're being to you.
A sense of humor certainly is valuable, and I've noticed that your responses to others' comments, or the sort of fabled anonymous comments that would litter your posts, they always seem to be quite a bit more diplomatic than I noticed from, especially, as I said before, and this is going to be a contrast I'll bring up a few times, your behavior on the blog is so much different than many established people, shall we call them, who come to blogging after having already become famous elsewhere. Do you know what I mean? They're not always, this is maybe something about the suitability of substance to form, but a lot of people who do one thing and then blog, they don't quite know how to handle themselves. How have you avoided that?
I had a long, intensive training period on some bulletin boards, which were fairly tough. I mean, this probably goes back to boarding school. I went to a tough boarding school in Scotland. My family was in Greece, and I got sent back for 3 years from the age of 10 to 13. And, you really had to learn how to defend yourself in that situation. People could be so vicious, and, there would be cliques and there would be bullies, and, you would learn the politics of aligning yourself with cool guys or powerful guys to avoid becoming the victim of the bullies. And all that stuff was very, very relevant at boarding school. So I think I went through that the first time at the age of, 12, whatever. I went through it the second time in my 40s, my early 40s, when I started engaging with people on bulletin boards. And these were smart people. They were music critics and whatever, but they had insecurities and they had their political reflexes, which often you could trigger, you could set off with some hot button topics, and then they would pile onto you, and there would be this hive swarm behavior, and you could easily get stigmatized as a troll, or there'd be this mockery thing which would start up. So I mean, I think I learned how to respond and how to fight back, and how to use humor and derision also. Momus is the god of derision, the god of mockery, so I did my fair share of mocking back. I hope I didn't bully people. There were times that I did feel I picked on people and bullied them myself, in an intellectual bully kind of way. And I felt actually really terrible about that. I mean, that was part of the compulsion, of course. The emotional compulsion of the internet was precisely when you would stay up trembling, wondering, hitting the the refresh button every 10 minutes. What are they going to say? I made this comment, this controversial comment. Are they going to, are 100 people going to attack me for saying that? And, that was fascinating and compelling and also nightmarish. So in a way, the blog was a slight retreat from that. I thought, well, hey, the only people who follow me to my own blog are going to be people who kind of like what I'm saying. But even on my own blog, I managed to irritate people and attract a few peanuts and rotten tomatoes.
You mentioned being called a troll, and I think of a troll as being someone on the internet who will simply engineers their comments to say whatever will create the greatest scope of a flame war to follow. But it seems that on Click Opera, what you were doing, I mean, as a reader, this was my perception, that you would often make arguments to essentially road test them and to see how well they would hold up if you were to make them. Not that you had, how to put it, not that you were expressing a conviction you could never change, or not that you were trying to stir up controversy, but there seemed to be just simply opinion experimentalism. Is that at all correct?
Well, that seemed to me like the great virtue of the internet was that it's virtual reality. In a sense, you can try things out, you can crash the plane and walk away from it, as I think David Bowie once put it. That is the whole point of a risk-free environment. But of course, it's not risk-free. And I think we've learned this, and Obama telling school children, be careful what you put on your Facebook pages, because this will come back to haunt you if you ever run for president. That is good advice. And of course, the internet is real life as well. But what I found was that being a troll, essentially this was all stuff I'd been taught as a student, as somebody studying artists at university, studying literature. I'd been taught it was great. It was very good to be provocative and to question social values and to come in and shake people up a little bit. All the great artists have done that. And I find it a little bit sad that on the internet, if you do that, you're called this word troll, or, it isn't valued enough. That I think it's generally, of course, it was called épater le bourgeois in France. You were shocking the bourgeois, and the bourgeois liked to be shocked. They would go to the theatre half expecting and hoping to be shocked. But I guess the internet's not so different.
With the blog, as far as one, if we're going to call it perhaps one artwork of many that you make, you've written quite a bit on the blog about art as a forum in which one can tell lies, shall we call them, and thus posit a world where they're true. Now, is what we've talked about, putting opinions out there, seeing how they're reacted to, is that a branch of this where you construct an argument and perhaps you might change your mind, but for that moment you create in the world of that post a world where you believe that strongly?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great intellectual exercise to make people think the unthinkable, and to use transgression, what Georges Bataille, who was a great hero of mine in my 20s, called transgression. I think I wanted to look into those parallel worlds. And I think Brian Eno, who you mentioned earlier, he really influenced me a lot in that sense, that he said, I think he was on TV in the 80s, and he just had like 1 minute to say something that would interest people. And he said, often art is just about telling a lie that creates the parallel world in which that lie is true. I think those were not his exact words, and but that's how I remember him saying that. And I thought, wow, I just never thought of things that way, that that a lie could be constructive and creative, and that you would then triangulate the difference between that imaginary parallel world and the world you knew. So, of course, it's not unrealistic to go into that other world. It's simply that you have an alternative point of view that you can triangulate with the realistic, hard-edged, hard-fact world that you know. And then it's the difference between those two worlds that's really interesting. Because it's too easy to be stuck in habituation, in the kind of lazy ways of seeing, your reflexive feelings and thoughts about things. You need somebody to come along and say, things could be different. There is a parallel world. It's an imaginary parallel world, but it has a great relevance to our real world.
My mind is, of course, going to one of your books, the Book of Scotland's, where on the cover we do see that exact line you just said about lying and thus creating parallel worlds in which that lie is true. And that book is a complete enterprise of nothing but the Scotlands, descriptions of the Scotlands of various parallel worlds. And I wonder, how central is this creation of possible worlds to your own definition of art making? I mean, you've said, of course, it is a part. Is that the core of it? Is that what you're going to do more of in this post-click opera era in your career? Or is it just one function of many that you think your art can achieve?
Yeah, well, I think it's essential to what I'm doing, what I want to do, and I keep coming up with scenarios, possible scenarios for my next book, my next novel, and I think, well, the really hard thing is to write about honorable people and sympathetic and empathetic people. I wrote a kind of nasty book called The Book of Jokes, which was all about, dirty jokes happening in a family and just the most terrible, awful things one after the other. And I thought, well, that's kind of, in a way, that's transgression in the easy register. But the really hard thing would be to transgress against precisely that nihilism and say, let's create a world where people are actually nice to each other. But then, the sort of provocateur in me comes along and says, yeah, let's make that really nice world where everyone's nice to each other, but let's set it in North Korea. That's going to really annoy people. So it's very, very hard for me to escape from this kind of impish perversity.
I do have to follow that last bit. You mentioned North Korea. You do seem to have a fascination with the place. I think most people do. But what is your interest in North Korea?
I think in a sense it's a time warp, and it's a bit like Japan would be if Japan had, after the Second World War, somehow gone communist instead of ultra capitalist. And it's got a lot of the Asian qualities that I like, I respond to aesthetically, but it's in this weird kind of void where nobody's talking to it. I suppose North Korea is the troll of the world, and it is a parallel universe, and it's there, it's real, it's really hard to get into. I do have friends who visited North Korea. A writer called Christian Kracht went there, took photographs, experienced the theatrical facades of the city, the sort of actors who are paid to look like pedestrians and to ride the subways and operate computers, and in fact people don't have computers there, and the subway doesn't really operate, and there are power cuts most of the day. So as soon as you leave the subway station, they just switch off the lights and lock it up behind you. But you know that they're fooling you, and they know they're fooling you, but the fiction continues. So North Korea is the perfect fictional nation. It's really the creation of this one man, Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il. They are the authors, and of course they have Kim Jong-il is a frustrated film director, so his whole nation is like this movie set.
I do share quite a large fascination with that place. Of course, it is, as an American, it's not easy for me to go there. I've talked to Russians who have gone there. You wouldn't have as much of a problem, would you, as a Scottish citizen?
To get in there, I don't know. Do they vet you to see your ideology? I mean, perhaps they could find the writing on my blog where I said I was an emotional communist, that I responded, on a purely emotional level to the imagery of people wearing Mao suits and things. Perhaps they would like that.
Now, it's, as far as one more thing on North Korea, I'm going to throw this in. It is interesting in that it is the sort of last real parallel universe, shall we say. It does seem to be, from the documentation of it, as different in many fascinating ways as one gets. At the same time, I do nurture my own fascination with the place, but I never feel particularly free of guilt about it, because of course I do realize people are starving there, and a lot of what fascinates me also has the effect of holding back livable lives, you might say. Do you ever get the same feeling?
Well, this is the ethical problem about parallel worlds, is that when they're actually real worlds as well, their difference cannot be preserved just in order to make you or me as affluent bourgeois citizens of the West have something to be interested in. I mean, that would be the just pure selfishness on our part, just to say, well, I hope they never change, because they're so interesting to look at and write books about and make novels about, whatever. Yeah, of course that's a problem. But it's a problem that is poverty just a number? Is it just having no money, or is it a culture? And in some ways, I'm very attracted to the culture of poverty, and I think that affluence itself is deeply problematical and destructive. But you can never actually say we should all be poorer. Let's all throw away our cars and ride bicycles. It's really hard to say that to people, because once technology is a cruel master, and it says once you get to this level, you can never go back down to that level before. it's really hard to become post-materialist and, say, throw away the cars, throw away the computers, let's go back to pens or bicycles. Really hard.
This is one reason why click opera has been especially fascinating in the past few years because with of course the economic troubles worldwide going on, there has been that incentive to get poorer, I suppose, or to live in to live in a way that is that is in not fundamental, but in many fundamental ways different than before. And that seems to have been something that has fascinated you to observe and to figure out how people respond. Is it still a subject that interests you, the way people respond to how conditions tighten economically?
Yeah, it is, and I continue to be fascinated by Japan. I'm just back from one of my many Japan trips, and I'm organizing an exhibition in Britain for 2012. Actually, it's time to coincide with the Olympics in London in 2012, called After Gold. And really, the theme of that After Gold exhibition is a post-materialist theme. It says that we're after gold, maybe after gold medals, or after gold in the sense of money, but there is a time after gold. When you've won the medal, and then you say, okay, what matters now? Or maybe you've reached your midlife crisis and you say, what the hell is life about? And what am I going to do with the rest of my life? That's another after gold moment. Or you've got a lot of money and you were so ambitious when you were earning the money, and then when you get it, you don't know how to spend it, and you realize that you have no talent for quality of life, just quantity. So I do find that really interesting, because culture steps in at that moment when you say it's not about quantity of money, it's about values and lifestyle and what I actually do with every second. I'm living in the now. I don't want to live for the future and just accumulate in this Protestant Puritan way money for a time that I will never actually enjoy in the present. So yeah, I think the Japanese case is very interesting because they have been a very, very successful, very wealthy culture that's been on the skids been in recession for essentially 20 years. I mean, they're kind of in slight growth right now, but there's always a margin of, say, 10% of post-materialist citizens in countries like Germany, Scandinavia, in the US as well, in Australia, New Zealand. There's this kind of train of opinion where people think actually it's not about just bling and cash. It's about how we live and being caring to the planet and all the rest of it. In Japan, there seems to be a slightly larger margin of people who think that way. It's still, probably less than 20% of the population, but there seems to be a certain ethical current there, which I respond to.
Is this Japanese sensibility toward acquisition, toward wealth, whatever you want to call it, is this the reason why even when I look at documentation of Japan in its poorest moments over the 1990s, and there were some bad economic ones there, it never looks like a poor country. Do you know what I mean? It never looks bad. It never looks wrecked.
Well, I mean, certain parts of Osaka, I was just staying in Osaka, and certain parts of Osaka do look very poor. But poor in the sense of, they could look like parts of Bangkok, or, there are a lot of flop houses and homeless people, although they've cleared out the homeless people who were most visible around the zoo in Osaka recently. But yeah, in another sense, everybody in Japan is poor because everybody lives in these very, very cramped and tiny apartments. And, in some senses, they don't have good heating systems, for instance. They have very tiny little cars or just bicycles, whatever. So in some sense, it's a kind of communist capitalist country, that you could imagine these people, they're working very hard. They're working for big corporations with global brand names like Honda, Toyota, whatever, but they're also not doing very well materially. They might be buying very expensive Louis Vuitton bags or whatever it is, but that'll be a once in a lifetime purchase, and they're eating really cheap food or whatever. So there's a kind of modesty, but also Japan is a little bit ahead of the West in terms of the Gini coefficient which measures inequality. So Japan is a slightly more equal society than say the US or Britain, but not that much. It's actually the gap is actually narrowed recently. So there are some super affluent Japanese people and some super poor Japanese people. It's kind of polarizing a little bit.
It has become the cliche to talk about the sort of hard-working Japanese salaryman who is simply like a hamster spinning a wheel and may work himself to death or may just get drunk a lot and fall asleep in a tube at the subway station. And that does not seem to be an enviable fate in any way. It seems to me that being an outsider in Japan is kind of the thing to be.
Well, it's very tough because if you're an outsider, you're really an outsider. I mean, you're really hidden away, and nobody will ever see you. You stay in your room. The hikikomori problem is still very strong there. It's very difficult. I think foreigners have a certain freedom in Japan. They're left to their own devices. They used to be secluded on islands off the coast, but now they're kind of allowed to mingle. But you never quite break through and never quite get accepted if you're a foreigner there. I think for Japanese themselves, there are still huge numbers of obligations which bring stresses and pressures with them, work obligations, family obligations. But I would say the image of the overworked salaryman is an 80s image. It's a Showa period image because actually there isn't that much work to do in Japan. And there are a lot of make work they have huge overemployment, which is actually good because it distributes income better. But you see a lot of old people, especially now, working. Of course, they have a shrinking population, so they're going to have to employ more women and more old people beyond retirement age just to kind of keep the jobs going. But they also like having, if there's a road being dug up or something, they have 6 people waving you past, and their job is just to stand there and wave a wand. It doesn't really seem necessary, but it's a kind of social equity. It's a way to distribute income.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can check out our complete interview archive and more at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Nick Currie, better known to those who follow his music, his art, his journalism, and formerly his blogging as Momus. I was struck on one of Click Opera's posts. You had a sort of a survey, somewhat parodic, it seemed to me, about a sort of reader satisfaction. You asked about various elements of the blog. People said, yes, I like it. No, I don't. Do more of this. Do less of that. You had one question about, I believe, the Japan coverage, because you do write quite a bit about Japan, even when you're not traveling there. And it is some of the most fascinating content. And there was a surprisingly large amount of people, correct me if I'm wrong, but who voted that the Japan stuff is actually the reason they're there in the first place. Now, how much have you gained a reputation as an observer of Japan purely by your blogging efforts?
Well, I have. It's because it's fueled by love of Japan, but also because there's a constantly replenishing source of kids. My nephew, who's like 16 now, just in love with Japan, the same way I've been all my life. I don't know why I got interested in Japan. It's a mystery to me. I don't know where I heard about it in the British media in the 60s and 70s. There wasn't very much about Japan. But my nephew, obviously there's been video games, computer games, anime, manga, all that stuff has really interested his generation. So on LiveJournal especially, which has got this reputation of being for teenagers and, young kids who love little cute icons of Sailor Moon or whatever it is, then those people were a natural audience. But actually there's not much overlap between my interest in Japan and their interest in Japan, because I've hardly ever seen any anime or manga or, that's not my point of entry. Or Hello Kitty, all that stuff. My point of entry is really that Japan is just a classic parallel world. It's an island on the other side of the world from Britain, kind of the same shape as Britain, and yet totally different. And that's what really fascinates me. The last Click Opera entry about Japan was just about the amazing anomaly that when you look at Last FM top 10 lists for countries, people scrobbling their favorite music all over the world, Japan is the only non-Anglo-Saxon country that has 70 or 80% of scrobbled tracks coming from their domestic territory. Now that's kind of incredible because it suggests that Japan is the only advanced other culture that exists out there. The Chinese are, at least if they're using Last FM, they're not listening to Chinese material, beyond, say, 10, 20%. The French, they might go to 40%. They've got Phoenix stuff, Punk Air, and Serge Gainsbourg, but that's unusual. That's unusually high. Most countries are totally supplied by the Anglosphere when it comes to pop music, and it's a one-way culture flow. It's a hub and spoke model. There is this powerful center, which is the white Anglo-Saxon center, allied with black music also, which is spreading popular music and culture from this central point, which is LA, London, New York, outwards all over the world. And it's globalization serving a very small number of interests. These 5 mega music corporations which exist and which are very centralized. And so I find it really fascinating that the Japanese have managed to, by a kind of passive aggression, they've managed to set up an alternative culture which is super advanced, I would say even more advanced than ours, and yet has its own cultural landscape, its own TV shows. You don't see American TV shows on Japanese terrestrial TV. You don't hear. Of course, you can buy every Western artist you want in a Japanese record store, but mostly the Japanese are just really interested in their own culture, the culture they make, and it's so different. And it's like why is this possible? Because the tendency of a monoculture is to crush all resistance. It's a monopoly logic, and there is a cultural monopoly. I'm kind of hoping it'll change, and that China's rise to power, Brazil's rise to power, India's rise to power will change the world. But I just hope I stick around long enough to see that. It's not that I'm anti-American, but I know America so well now, and I feel I'm almost an American. I've lived in New York. I know that culture. But I kind of want there to be other alternatives, because there are other ways to live and see and feel and touch and smell.
You don't want to have all the possible other worlds come only from art. Some of them should actually be real worlds.
Yeah, I think art, it can't really do very much in its little ghetto if it's just, sponsored by Deutsche Bank or whatever, and it's an art fair and it just goes on rich people's walls. I think you have to have viable, commercially successful cultures, people who know how to sell things. The Indians are fantastic at selling things and very entrepreneurial. And so I'm fascinated by what India does, because India really has its own very strong culture, very ancient culture. I'm fascinated by what these people do when they get super modern technology and advanced culture.
And on the theme as well of art presenting other possible worlds, other ways of living, I do think of Click Opera, I know we've talked about it as an exploration of the web, and often it's an exploration of media and media from other cultures, Japan as well. But of course, it's also a document of your own life, because you have one of the more bloggable lives, I would say, that I've ever seen, because you're always going around to different countries, doing different art things, having different art experiences. And to me, Click Opera was seeing your life itself on there. If I was to view your life as a work of art, which I consider people's lives to be and how they live them as creating that art, that your life itself was, and I think for many people is, kind of another possibility, because it is so different from the lives of almost everyone who reads your blog. Do you know what I mean? Was that ever in your mind as an artistic goal of Click Opera, to present a life that was different enough to qualify as, for many readers, a parallel world?
I think I'm going to sound like Marie Antoinette, but I don't know what other people's lives are like. I've never had a day job really, and all I know is this kind of pop lifestyle where you're touring in a tour bus or whatever. I mean, that's really what I knew in my 20s, and then that developed into, it might have been more, you would go and do art things in particular cities, or you'd travel for other projects. But I don't know, is that very unusual? I think there is a danger that you present yourself as, you're either accused, this is one of the prolepsies that I've developed, that I've learned how to anticipate objections because of trolls and people, anonymous people. One of the things I've found is that people say, either you're a hypocrite if you're saying people should do something that you don't do yourself, or you're a narcissist if you're saying that people should do what you do because you do it. So it's very hard to hit a median between those two.
You're swarmed by comments, whether or not, whatever tack you take.
Yeah, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And yeah, you can't really propose your own life as a fantastic shining example. A lot of people, I'm struck by this, that we fly more miles each year, and people who wouldn't have been to Japan, for instance, now they go fairly regularly to Japan. And so I don't think, I went in 92 for the first time to Japan, and I think it was still slightly exotic then. I don't think it is so much now. You see a lot of foreigners in Tokyo, not so much in the smaller towns, but so it's a little tricky to keep saying, hey, I have an exotic life.
I certainly don't mean that you were saying that you had one, or that you were holding yourself up as an example of anything, but this is essentially maybe not even a voluntary thing, but simply by virtue of writing about your life, it comes across as not under a microscope, but as something for others to observe and maybe realize that, well, because let's say, if I told people about your life who didn't know it, they might say, well, that's not possible. It's not possible to always be going to different countries and to be doing art things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very touched by actually some of the comments just today on the last blog entry, and people saying, you really made me realize possibilities for my own life, or you made me see my problems differently and see I could overcome my problems, or a lot of these testimonial type comments that I kind of hoped, I always hoped that I would be having that kind of inspirational effect, but I never was arrogant enough to take it for granted that I did. And often I felt like I was just this awful kind of poncing poseur. I was made to feel that way by a lot of people. And, why not? It's fine. They felt that strongly. And everything is true. I kind of think that everything people say is true about you, but it's just a partial truth. And it's really nice to see the sweetness and stuff that's coming out now that I've ended the blog. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe I'll live a very quiet, unobserved life now, and or maybe not. Knowing me, I'll probably want to keep showing off. And
Especially toward the end of Click Opera, you wrote a bit about how much time the blog consumed and how it had become, essentially, a full-time job for you, but one that had also had quite a number of rewards to it as well. Did you, in 2004, foresee at all that this would become the core of what your career would be in the 2000s? If it in fact had become that?
not at all. I'm just a bandwagon jumper, and people were talking in 2004, 2000. I mean, 2003. It was all like, "Oh, have you seen Friendster?" And then 2004, it's, "Oh, this thing blogging." And I think I must have asked somebody, "What is blogging?" And they would say, "Well, it's from this word weblog, and it's a log of all the websites you visit." So my first, I sat down naively and just copied this rather slavishly. I said, "Okay, well, I'm just going to make a list of all the." So my first Click Opera entries are just like, well, today I went to this website, and then I went to that website, and here's a list of them, and that one was quite good. This one was a bit boring. That's what I thought you were supposed to do. And then just very slowly began to develop, and start elaborating my own interests. And then sparring with people was really important, that you would have. I got a really sweet message from Marksy, this David W. Marks, who is actually the editor of CNN Go website now in Tokyo, consumer travel and stuff website. We had some big sparring in 2005 or whatever, and sometimes it was bitter, and other times it was, I was helping increase his traffic to his blogs and websites and things. But he left this message saying something like, "It was great sparring with you, my friend." So that kind of, I thought, that's really sweet, that we made up in the end, and it was all about forming community and giving people the emotional compulsion to come back every day.
And what was at the center of the drive you seem to have had to make your blog posts actual, even if they were short, actual essays that were actually written, that always appeared to have had time and perhaps a revision put into them? Because increasingly, now it's even rarer now that you've finished Click Opera, but especially toward the final couple years of the blog, everything around it, the blog landscape, sort of started to wither, not in terms of there being fewer blogs, certainly there are more, but in terms of the content per post, perhaps, or the effort per post has been slowly or maybe rapidly falling in the past few weeks, months, years. Was it kind of a hold the fort mentality for you to keep the quality up, or is it just an instinct that's the way you've got to do things?
Well, I think things are relative, and they always seem to be going to the dogs, declining from a golden age. And actually, when I started blogging, I had been doing before these huge essays on my website, which were much longer. They would be, 3,000 words or something. And so blogging seemed almost like tweeting does today. Like, okay, I'll do this every day. I'll do mini essays every day on a blog instead of these maxi essays, these huge dissertations, which I was doing maybe once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks on the website. So it seemed like the lazy option. But actually, it developed more into a daily essay, but that's just because I'm kind of I'm very aware that life is short and that you don't want to waste life just being phatic. This word phatic, which just means saying, "Hey, how you doing?" And I'm not really into that, because life is just too short to just say, "Hey, how you doing?" And things good? Yeah, things are good. And nobody actually communicates anything of substance. Nothing has changed. Nothing is thought about, really. So I've always really wanted to just even if it upset people a little bit or kind of challenged their their feelings or thoughts. Just go a little bit deeper into things. But I think I'm essentially quite a superficial person. A lot of the content of my daily blogs was just Google spawn, I call it. I would just cut and copy and paste, stuff that I found interesting, and put a little commentary and context around it. And so it was really just classic cut and paste journalism. But in the end, you can see that it all reflects my concerns. And I was doing what a lot of smart people do on the internet, which is that you just repackage content which is already out there. But ultimately, you become the Ouroboros if you do that. The Ouroboros is the snake that swallows its own tail, and it's an old symbol. And you start tasting your own tail a little bit too much.
Now, you seem to be, regardless, a lot more comfortable with what the internet has changed as far as the landscape of creating things, distributing things, and certainly a lot of the post-materialist lifestyle discussion that has gone on your blog, it seems to me, would not have been quite as possible without the internet. Now, a lot of musicians, especially those who got popular before the internet was big, they're not so comfortable. They do think of the greater ability to exchange content, data, information over the net as a problem more than a solution. You seem to be sort of singularly enthusiastic. Is that an accurate perception?
Well, that could be pure arrogance. It could be the attitude that, hey, mythologization is important for people who are actually not as interesting as they seem to be. And, I'm not going to mention any names, Billy Idol or Marilyn Manson, whatever, no names there. But I just think there's a certain kind of old-fashioned rock star who, the less they actually got to spoke, a bit like when the talkies came along and half the film stars just dropped away out of sight because they had bad voices, or they didn't really, have the charisma when you heard them anymore. And I think I was always somebody who I really wanted to. I was jumping up and down eagerly saying, I can do this. I can. I won't disappoint people if they hear me talking. But that's probably just because I'm a teacher at heart, and I really like engaging with people and changing the way they think.
How successfully do you think you have been able to do that, specifically through the medium of blogging? I know I've been made to see myself many of the perspectives you've put out there, and I've seen some in the comments as well, people who will admit to being swayed by your own types of reasoning. How optimistic can one be about the changing of minds via something like a blog?
Well, I certainly changed my own mind just by thinking things through much more carefully than I would have done. When you're in public, you're under the full glare of scrutiny of, potentially the whole world is paying attention, and you said something stupid, and then you have to find a way to take it back without looking like you totally are eating your words. Or I think that's a really good intellectual training, because you have the emotional compulsion, which is probably based in your vanity and narcissism, to get things right. And so you go out there and you try to you engage much more vigorously with things.
What sort of a community did you find, if you can characterize it in any way? It seemed quite diverse. The community that formed around Click Opera. What can you say about the character of your readership?
I think they're smart. First and foremost, they were some really smart people, and they knew often more about the things I was blogging about than I did. There was always somebody who would correct me or send me off to an interesting website to learn more about things. For God's sake, I don't even speak Japanese, and I was blogging so much about Japan, and I was then going head to head with people, having arguments about things which they knew much more about because they could read the Japanese media directly, and I would have to run into the other room and say to my Japanese girlfriend, quick, can you translate this? What does this say? Or, paste it in. And in the early days of my blog, like 5-6 years ago, Google Translate was not very good, and you had Babelfish or whatever, and you would paste Japanese stuff in there and try to get it into English, and it would just be gobbledygook. So it was tough. But, I think I learned on the job. I think I learned how to conceal my defects a little bit better. Although I always admitted that my Japanese was just totally not there, and that in a sense it was a projection. That what I was doing with Japan especially was projecting my love and my fascination with its otherness. And I was an old-fashioned Orientalist in the style of that Edward Said said was really a terrible thing to be. I'm not convinced by the late Edward Said's thesis that it's bad to be Orientalist. I think it's just bad to be a mean Orientalist.
Is Japan a place you could actually live? You've talked about moving there, or the prospects of moving there, why it's hard to move there. But considering that it is such, it's a subject for you, it's something you observe. Is it a country in which, let's say that any financial and legal issues were resolved and you could just move there? Could it be a place you could simply live in?
It could. I mean, it just basically, it's like playing roulette or something. It increases the stakes because there's potential for great misery in Japan for a foreigner, which is the alienation, the exclusion, the sense of being incompetent and being stared right through. You're really ignored. Japanese people are much more comfortable dealing with other Japanese people than with foreigners. So you will actually be, it's like you're a ghost some of the time. You're just not there. On the other hand, there's huge potential for ecstasy, for fantastic fascinations, and there's beautiful landscapes. There's some fascinating cityscapes. The world's biggest city, Tokyo, which is still for me the most exhilarating place to be. You know, maybe, New York is like number 2 for me. Tokyo is definitely number 1. So, I mean, yes and no is my answer. In a sense, I'm happy just visiting Japan every year. That allows me to keep my distance and value it also. You know, it doesn't become something I take for granted, as it might if I lived there. But it also allows me to avoid the slight sense of cabin fever you get, or the sense of detachment you get, or even the sexual excitement of it. Because I mean, if you're wired like I'm wired, it's the only country where walking down the street is just almost an overwhelmingly sensual experience. So that can be great, and that can also be horribly distracting and dangerous.
You write quite a bit about place on Click Opera and the effects of cities and of wherever one chooses to reside. And what I found most interesting was what you've said about how cities can or cannot foster subculture. And you mentioned quite recently New York and Tokyo as being places that are on the pricey side as far as being able to encourage the creation of subcultures. And Berlin, where you live, is as the opposite, as being sufficiently cheap that anything can essentially arise there. Is that actually an obstacle in say a Tokyo? Is it something that you would run into if you happen to base yourself there?
Yeah, I think this is why all the hipsters and the creative artists like Ryan Tricartin or whatever moved from New York to Philly. Although actually, I think he's from Philly. It's not a good example, but people have to get out of New York. It's not that you can't be creative in these big expensive cities. It's that it's a different type of creativity that you have to do. I mean, when I lived in New York City, the people I knew who were in at that time fledgling electro clash bands like Fisher Spooner, they surprised me by having day jobs with Marc Jacobs and MTV and corporate media like that, and they would do their music stuff in the evenings and weekends, and they would try to fit it all in. Of course, they had to be superhuman to have all the energy to do both, but you needed, just to make rent, you needed to work really hard for those big corporations. It's not so much the case in Berlin. I mean, we don't have the big corporations here. We don't have the option to do it. And if you're an artist, you can make the work in Berlin because the space is cheap, but you can't sell it here because there are no rich collectors here. You have to sell it in Munich or London or somewhere else. Japan is generally an expensive country, but there are little pockets of cheapness. If you go outside the cities, it's much cheaper, obviously. Food is actually very good and quite cheap in Japan, so you can sustain yourself very well there just with food. And I got the feeling, I was sort of talking myself into maybe living in Osaka and saying, well, it's a bit like Berlin in the sense that you can slum it. It's the old boho thing. You can slum it. You can live like a sort of bohemian aristocrat and live cheaply but live well. And my favorite music comes from Osaka. There's an underground there, a noise underground, a kind of very funky underground. I went this last trip to a place, a building in the center of Osaka, which is it's really rundown office building, which has been converted into small bars, and like there's a Gothic Lolita bar next to a Hawaiian surf bar next to these amazing little one-man operations. And a lot of the music scene in Osaka is coming out of places like that, where you can have a really cheap bar with a really low rent, and there's a grungy subcultural feeling to it, which you don't really experience in Tokyo.
How have you yourself historically managed? It seems you've always managed to avoid the meaningless hack work to make rent you discuss on the blog. Have you always gotten out of that? By the way, I should get that clear first. Is this something you've actually avoided your whole life?
I've dabbled a little bit in it. I mean, I've done music for Nike, or when I was living in New York, I took on some commercial music and stuff like that. But very little. I mean, I think it helps to be mean and Scottish, because I basically I pare my needs down to the bare minimum, and I actually enjoy that. I enjoy the ratio of effort to effect. The efficiency of being able to get by on very, very little money. People think my parents are supporting me or something. Absolutely not the case. Well, not really the case. They've helped occasionally, but very, very little. I just don't eat very much. That's why I'm skinny.
How much does the internet help you lead this lifestyle? How much does it make possible? Because, I mean, obviously, entertainment is essentially taken care of if you have a net connection. How much could you do this life, this kind of what you called the low-calorie lifestyle in reference to something you said as a kid? How well could you do it without the net?
Yeah, the net has been a huge help, and it lowered the cost of access, obviously, to self-publishing media enormously. When I started in the 80s, you'd have to get a tool die cutter to make your master pressings for your vinyl or whatever it was. And this was major industrial equipment, recording in recording studios. Very few people had home studios. That all changed, the late 80s, the early 90s. Digital stuff came along that was very cheap and very capable, much better than the quality that people were used to in professional studios. So, and then, of course, the internet, which became the digital distribution network, which was virtually free. And of course, it's got a downside, which is that people expect everything free now. They expect things to have zero overheads, cultural items to be basically free because they cost nothing to produce. And that means that it's tough to get people to part with their money for you to live as an artist. But the way you do it is you play live shows, you have a real world event, because people still need to get away from their computers. So paradoxically now you have to escape from this digital media, which was so great initially. And you have to say, we're having a concert, come along, pay the entry fee, buy a drink, we'll take some of the bar cut, and we'll make a happening. And you'll actually be in physical proximity with other people, not stuck in front of your computer. That's now the unique selling proposition for artists. Get people away from the computer.
Are you confident that these real-world happenings, these decisively non-internet events one can stage, will be, to put it grandly, the salvation of the worried artist who thinks they won't be able to live any longer in this kind of post-internet world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a 1-2 thing. You obviously use Facebook to tell people your happening is happening, and then you milk them of the entry fee when they come in, and you live on that money. It's both, and it's not like we're all going to become totally detached from the internet. And a lot of people thought when I announced I was ending my blog that I would. Nick Currie has left the internet, Elvis has left the arena. Whatever. It's not like that at all. I'll be totally present on the internet in lots of different ways. But it's just that I was a little bit overexposed and a little bit, the blogging was just too damn good. It was just such a satisfaction for me every morning to post something and to have comments. And I would just spend all day dealing with these comments, fielding them, thinking of witty things to say. And actually, your life slips by and you realize that you were looking at this electron, this single electron that's scanning very rapidly in front of you. And you're like, you're in Plato's cave. You're trapped down there and you're looking at shadows dancing in the firelight.
The name of the blog, once again, whose archives will remain up to be read by all comers, is Click Opera, and the books are The Book of Scotland's and The Book of Jokes. Nick, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program, and because this airs tomorrow, happy birthday.
Thank you very much, Colin.
If you'd like to read the complete Click Opera archive, visit imomus.livejournal.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can hear our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com. Of course, the website of the man who produces our theme music, Ben Althouse, is available as well at benalthouse.com. If you have any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, anywhere in between or otherwise, send that on to Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.